network itself, as well as the assets that may be mobilized through the network. So as an individual, for example, you have an asset which represents your social network. And also, it's not just the network, it's also who you knows, who do they know, what assets can they mobilize to help you. So that's the notion of social capital. Now, before I get into the propositions, I'll just talk briefly about how we define networks in this context. For the closure and leader centrality propositions, a tie in the network is defined by co-participation in a single-threaded discussion of the public forums of the project. So the presumption here is that the communication around the project happens in the public forum, and we look at a threaded discussion which is started by one person can post an initial message, other people can come along and post additional messages in a kind of thread. It's kind of an online discussion. And so if two people have participated in that single discussion thread, we establish a link between them. There's a tie, conversational tie. And if a third person comes in, now all three are tied together. So that's how we define the network and the ties for these two constructs. For bridging, we use a different method. There we use membership. And the reason is that we didn't have access to conversational ties. We don't know who is talking to who from this community bridging out to other communities.
But this is a slide. It's not good.
7.5.
7.5. It's a sneaky slide. Sorry.
How many slides are there total?
There's half 25 and a half.
Whole number of 25.
I rounded off.
We're not sure about the
If
inaccurate.
you round down, it's 25. Yes, I know. I thought it was important to put this in.
Let me go to 7.6.
7.72.
7.65.
Anyway, yeah, sorry for that, but it was a last-minute sneaky slide. So for bridging, we define the tie by membership, and this is commonly used. There's been quite a bit of studies of membership ties. It's just that for social capital theory, generally the notion is more about conversational ties. And so we recognize this might be a limitation, but we do use membership, meaning to the extent that I'm a member of other project communities, those are my ties to the outside world. And the assumption is that if I'm a member of these other communities, I'm going to tend to talk to people in those other communities. So that's how we define it there. Now we also, again, if you think of the team analogy, we have kind of three interpretations of, well, what exactly is the team? Because we look at a project community as basically everybody who gives any meaningful participation to the project. And that basically are people who are either registered with the project, who do a lot of the code writing, or people who do participate in the public forums. So that's kind of the whole community that we can see. And on average, that's about 67 people, by the way, the ones we to give some numbers to it. So in some respects, we might say, well, gee, the team is that whole group of 67 people. But then we say, well, but we recognize that in communities, and there's a lot of discussion about open source, that the core developers represent an important subgroup who tend to write more code, make more decisions, and so forth. And so in some cases, we say, well, you know what, maybe the team is just the core. We're going to eliminate looking at these peripheral members and say, let's focus in. Maybe that's where social network structure matters. And then finally, we can even dig further and say, we can also look at just the administrators and say, as a subgroup, maybe they're the team. Those are the ones among the core who are actually the leaders, who have certain rights to control access to the repository and so forth. Now, the way we define this in our study, which is pretty clean, is you are a member of the core subgroup if you're registered with the focal project. If you participate in the public forum of the project, but you're not registered, you're a peripheral member. So that's basically how you see whether somebody's in the core or the peripheral. And the whole project is broken into those two groups. Now within the core, there is at least one and sometimes more administrators, and we call that a subgroup. It's kind of a subgroup of the core. And they are also registered with the project, but they're also registered as administrators. So they have the special privileges that are granted to the administrator. So that's important because we don't just create three propositions for the three social network structures. We actually try to reflect some of these characteristics of communities and bring in these different interpretations of what team means. Okay, so getting into the propositions then. For closure, you can see we actually had 3 propositions. All of them do suggest the inverted U relationship. But we have one that looks at the closure of the whole group, one that looks at the closure just of the core subgroup. So that's where we say, well, you know, let's assume the team is just the subgroup. And then we have a third one which talks about, well, there's a lot of literature in open source that says it's important to get the peripheral members involved with the core. So we also look at the closure between those 2 groups, thinking there might be some different things happening there. So in the case of group closure, we do expect to see positive results from interaction needed to produce software, just like you would see in teams. But we do recognize that these open source communities are different, and some of the open source tools reduce the need for interaction. So for example, software modularity. It's recognized that modular software in open source, what that means is that the different modules, if you make a change to code in one module, if it's well done and well designed, that does not cause any change in another module. So it allows people, in a sense, to work somewhat independently of each other. So those kinds of tools do reduce this need for interaction. And further, we know that these are voluntary efforts, at least within our study population. And so at some point, there's going to be kind of a cost of ties effect. And these are people who are volunteering. So basically what we think is we will see this positive result, as we see here, but at some point, it's going to become too many ties or burdensome to this voluntary group, and you see then a negative downside. Now, core and peripheral 2-mode closure, we also suggest that, but in the case of core closure, we expect maybe some additional positive results because within the core, these are the people that are doing more of the work, in a sense, and so you'd expect to see more interaction among that group. So there you might see a more extended positive segment with maybe a little bit of a downturn. In the case of peripheral 2-mode closure, again, while you'd see some of these results, results, we think there'd be some additional positive results because the literature says it's important to involve the periphery in the core. Number 3.